Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fanfiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Warui Yatsu was not a nice man. He liked to hear women scream. He especially liked to hear women scream when his quirk. He cut short the thought. His barrister, a bitch of a woman who was defending him only because she knew it would look good for her, had told him again and again that he could not make odd faces in court. His boss had told him that as well. And his boss was paying, so he should listen to that. Instead, Warui sat and kept his expression clear. Court was a formality. Not that he thought he'd be avoiding his sentence. That was also coming, but it would be a far more lenient sentence than what someone would usually get. It always had been in the past. He knew that, because Warui was a member of the League of Villains. Sure, he wasn't one of the bigwigs, like Dabi, or Toga or Mustard, but he was a member. Not card-carrying. They didn't have cards. But being a member gave him certain protections, and they were showing now. His barrister might be doing the job because it would look good on her resume, but that's what she was telling herself. She was doing it because Kaysen had dirt on her and Kaysen reported to Dabi, and Dabi had said that he should be defended. That's how it worked. Though Dabi had called him once, while he was in remand. He'd told him something odd, but comforting. You might not even get a prison sentence this time, Dabi had said. The boss has pulled some strings. That had been a surprise. It made Warui feel invincible. The boss. He wasn't a fool. He knew Dabi and the other big names in the league had a boss. He just had no idea who it was. No one did. Dabi and the others did, but they didn't spill. But if the boss had taken a personal interest, then everything would be okay. He just had to sit here with a clear face. He could wonder later what his barrister would look like under him as his quirk held her down. He might even be able to find out. He could wonder what the judge would look like naked, shaking in fear as he approached her. Except, no. She was dumpy and old and he wouldn't debase himself that much, not even for her expression. Warui glanced over at the prosecution. The man looked confident. He resisted the urge to snort. Of course the man looked confident. Warui knew his history. He gave a small smile. The prosecution was going to lose this case. Such a pity. He'd have to learn that in this world there were winners and losers, and it was best if you associated with winners. The barrister would learn. Except. Warui knew how to read men. Dabi expected it. You had to know who could go the distance with the fights, or who was there to cause trouble. Warui dealt with those who caused trouble. His quirk restrained them and then something Dabi called a numu removed them. Sometimes permanently. Mostly just out the door. Even the league had only so many places they could stash the bodies, and Dabi liked to joke they were running out of room. The barrister appeared confident. Why was he confident? Your Honor, he was saying. The prosecution will forego seeking jail time in this case, as we believe this would be the perfect opportunity to test Carrie. Warui blinked. What the hell was that? But, no jail time? He could live with that. Drop the conviction as well, and I'll advise my client to consider it, his barrister said. Yatsu schooled his expression into something calm. She was too eager. No, a conviction must be recorded, the prosecution barrister said. Agreed, the judge intoned, giving Yatsu's barrister a hard look. What had she been trying to pull off? What was this Carrie? The court will consider it, the judge continued. Objection. The prosecution has never raised this option before. With respect, Your Honor, the prosecution feels that this case provides the perfect opportunity to test Carrie. The defendant has been found guilty multiple times of quirk-related offenses, and has shown no remorse for the death's cause, nor any empathy for the pain of those left traumatized by the use of his quirk. My client has displayed much empathy. His barrister objected. Warui wondered how the lies slipped so easily from her mouth. Oh wait, he was paying the bitch. Or rather the boss was. She was like all bitches. They would say anything for money. Past cases also have no regard to this one. In each previous case, my client has served his time of penance. It is circumstance, and the acts of the supposed victims which brought my client's use of his quirk in self-defense. It is lucky my client has such a quirk, or else he might have been hurt far worse. Warui looked at her. She sounded calm, but he could tell she was worried. He didn't like that. The prosecution barrister shook his head. As the defense has so graciously pointed out, the defendant has committed more than one crime and is a repeat offender. Given the multitudinous cases, the prosecution sees no evidence at reform, or even attempts to reform. Instead, the defendant has willfully used his quirk to harm others on multiple occasions. The defense claims self-defense, the evidence says attack. As such, the state would like to apply for the use of carry in this case. No, the use of carry is a fundamental violation of my client's human rights. The prosecution barrister looked to the defense. He could tell she didn't meant that, but it was one of the few logical arguments she could put forth. The prosecution understands that the use of carry is new, and while we would argue that it would prevent any possible future violations of quirk law, the prosecution understands that we are not here to speculate about the future. The barrister gave the judge a nod at that, knowing that Her Honor would have pointed it out otherwise. However, given the history of the defendant and the severity of the quirk violations, the prosecution will press for the use of carry. In exchange, as I stated, the prosecution will apply for the waiving of the mandatory jail term. Yatsu wasn't sure what to think. No one had explained carry, and while he was an intelligent man, the only clue as to what was going on was the strain on his barrister's face. "What's carry?" he asked. It had to be something really bad if the prosecution was willing to forego jail time. "The defendant will be silent," the judge announced. It sounded perfunctory. He hated that. It sounded like she'd made a decision already. "What's carry?" he demanded again. "Quiet," his barrister muttered, her lips barely moving. "No. What is this fucking carry thing?" he demanded. He couldn't leap up. He was chained in place. His quirk lurked close to the surface, but he knew better than to use it here. Oh, but it would be sweet to see that old bitch of a judge squirm. "You will be silent," the judge intoned, actually looking at him. "Or the court will ensure your silence." Warui snapped his jaw shut. He knew what that meant. Any case where the defendant was being tried for improper use of their quirk involved quirk suppressant cuffs, and in some cases muzzles, for those whose quirks operated through their mouths. But the court was free with them. It was used to silence annoying defendants like himself, and there was nothing he could do about it. The judge looked away when he was suitably cowed. "I will consider the use of carry," she said. "For now, please move on." Of course, no case is that easy. The barristers did move on. The defendant was found guilty. The evidence was damning. And that's how Warui Yatsu had a conviction recorded but no jail time, and was now, on the last morning of his time in remand, strapped to a table. Quirk restraining cuffs were on his wrists, but even if they weren't, there was no way he could break the restraints. It was cold. The room was sterile, and there was a huge one-way mirror taking up one entire wall. He knew there had to be people behind it, but the silence was deafening. Eventually a door opened. A man walked in. He was dressed in a white hazmat suit. His face wasn't visible through the mask. Warui stiffened. What the hell was going on here? All his barrister had said was that the bitch had said nothing useful. Just that he wouldn't be going to jail. He never agreed to this. Warui Yatsu, prisoner number dash. "I ain't a prisoner," he growled. The conviction had been recorded, but as the prosecution had requested, there was no jail time because of this carry crap. "Been selected for the use of carry dash," the man continued. What the fuck is Carrie? Warui demanded. The man ignored him and instead went to one of the white walls. A small drawer opened. Yatsu watched the man reach into it and pull out a small syringe. He had a bad feeling about this. What the fuck is Carrie? He demanded again. Administer. The voice came from the speaker system. What is it? Warui screamed, pulling away as much as he could. There was a sigh over the speakers. Carrie is an experimental punishment, a voice explained. It sounded tired. It sounded bored. Yatsu glared. It had to be one of the so-righteous bastards who were sitting behind the glass. Quirk Experimental Removal Initiative, the voice continued. What? Yatsu roared, his eyes widening. He pulled at the restraints. They weren't gonna take his quirk. Blood flowed from his wrists where the restraints cut into him. Administering sedative. That was an automated voice. He felt a pin prick at the back of his neck and everything went blurry. The man in the hazmat suit hadn't moved, but Warui could see him standing there. He could see the syringe in his hand. It shone in the light. As a repeat offender who has shown no remorse for your victim's suffering, you have been nominated for Carrie testing. Biosimip Industries is acting as guarantor in the event of any complications. Assuming none, after confirmation that your quirk has been permanently suppressed, you will be released. Yatsu tried to say no. He tried to deny it all, but his tongue wouldn't work. It came out like Naluga, which meant absolutely nothing. Administer now, please, the watching bastard said. Warui tried to struggle, but the sedative was powerful. His limbs were heavy and they didn't obey him. The man in the hazmat suit stepped forward. He pulled a small bottle from somewhere and there was a burst of cold on Yatsu's arm where the contents were sprayed on him. Alcohol, he recognized the smell. Then there was another pinprick. He wasn't even sure if he felt it or just thought he did. Then there was nothing. Before he knew it, the man withdrew the syringe and washed the area down with alcohol again. There wasn't even a need for a dressing. Monitoring, the automated voice said. Warui imagined there were any number of facilities in the watching room which were trained on him. He didn't know what they were monitoring. His could feel his heart beating as normal. He was breathing okay and the world was still fuzzy. How did you monitor a quirk? As far as he knew, there was no way of knowing unless it was being used, and with the cuffs he couldn't use his. Remove the cuffs, the instruction came. The man in the hazmat suit had put the syringe away, back into the little drawer that once more disappeared into the wall, leaving it smooth and featureless. The little bottle of alcohol was similarly gone. He was surprisingly dexterous for a man wearing rubber gloves, and soon the quirk restraining cuffs were gone. Warui noted how his blood looked on the white hazmat suit. It was starkly red. Monitoring, the automated voice said again. Swagger. Yatsu said. He was trying for shut up. Quirk receding. With the sedative, he couldn't even panic at that. Do you want me to bandage the cuts? The man asked, looking towards the glass. You should, came the bastard's voice again, but Warui could tell he didn't really care. He was more interested in the automated voice. He breathed in and out. He couldn't feel anything. He wasn't sure if he should feel anything except. Even with the sedative, Warui felt his eyes widen when he reached for his quirk. He couldn't activate it. He couldn't even feel it. It wasn't there. Quirk receded. The automated voice said. Good, the bastard commented. Thank you for your participation, Warui Yatsu. All being well, you will be released after further tests. This is a historic day and you should feel proud that you have played such an important role within it. AFO. Carrie program success. The Justice Department has successfully trialed a new punishment for repeat offenders in quirk related violence cases. Rumor has it that the program will be used to permanently suppress offenders' quirks, though spokespeople have been tight-lipped on what the acronym means, but a Freedom of Information request indicates that the program is being sponsored by major pharmaceutical company Biosimip Industries. They are perhaps best known for their revolutionary sleeping pills, which may be tailored to individuals to give an accurately timed sleeping pattern. Media relations at Biosimip Industries offered no comment on the carry program. Representative Imoku Kakariti looked at the tiny article on the 12th page of the paper. Most people didn't bother to read the physical paper anymore. It was for government and company announcements, and births, deaths, and marriages. It wasn't for real news, but the justice department was required to report on its programs, and while they usually did it via media release, it had been deemed best that carry just be quietly announced. Eventually the public would find out, but by then, they'd be used to the results. In this case, it was going to be easier to beg forgiveness, rather than ask for permission. There was going to be backlash, but that wasn't his problem. He sighed. There were times when he loved being an independent. Now was one of them. Aizawa Shoyuta looked around carefully. He was conscientious enough to ensure that his gaze wasn't obvious. He'd learned how to do that professionally as an underground hero. And despite it being 10 years or so since he had been a hero, he hadn't forgotten his skills. There was no one watching, and the camera in the corner was his feed. He unlocked the door, opening it just enough for him to slip through before it closed again. He stood in the dark for a few moments before flicking on the light. He paid extra for the storage unit to have power. It was for these times. He looked at the boxes. They contained the regalia of his time as a hero and some of his first cases after his reintegration. His examination was sharp. Shoyuta breathed a sigh of relief when he took in that nothing had changed. His capture scarf was still hanging half out of the top of one, and some of Hizashi's gear was strewn haphazardly around. All was in order. Aizawa stepped through the boxes, working his way between them until he was standing at the back of the storage unit. At least that's what it looked like. It was a false back. It concealed barely 5 centimeters of room. That small was not noticeable, and could be explained as a measurement error should anyone come in here. Carefully he began moving the concealing boards, stacking them to the side. Behind the wall was a corkboard. Photos, printouts of news articles, and other random things were pinned onto it. They were all joined by several spools of different colored threads. The board would make no sense to anyone looking at it. But the board was rather incriminating. The former pro-hero sighed as he looked at it. At the center there was a picture of Representative Imoku Kakariti. A large question mark was over his head. It was symbolic because after so many years, Shoyuta seemed to always have more questions about the man and precious few answers. Threads connected him to just about everything on the board. There were pictures of the League of Villains, Heroes, and Vigilantes. Other representatives were pictured as well, but nowhere near as prominently. If you spent some time looking, you could see a pattern. Some of the photos had black thread that lead to those who were dead. It was mostly on the hero side. Others had gold thread, and they tied back to Imoku Kakariti the closest. Shoyuta let his eyes trace over the images, seeing all the connections. So much had changed in the past few years. Not all of it for the better, but he was one of the lucky ones. When heroes had been forced to integrate, as they called it, he had other skills to fall back on. Most combat heroes just took the offered positions with the police, fire brigades, or sometimes with the military. Rescue heroes took positions with the emergency services, and any hero that had a healing quirk just walked into a hospital and was welcomed. On the surface it looked as if everything was neatly dealt with. Heroes were integrated. New study courses were made for those who passed the renamed Hero Public Safety Bureau's Psyche Assessment. They had been renamed the Quirk Usage Assessments, and were performed by the Center for Responsible Quirk Usage. The committee was still there, but they were far more closely monitored by a House of Representatives Oversight Committee. The committee that was headed by Imoku Kakariti. The argument there was that since he was an independent representative, he wouldn't be influenced by the major parties. Aizawa didn't buy the public line. He was far too used to heroics, where the truth was seldom what it seemed. And that's why the board existed. He hadn't taken employment with the police. He saw where that was going. The heroes who had taken that option had been forced to hunt down those who had become vigilantes. That had broken most of them, and they'd resigned, generally to retire to some other profession, after some retraining. In that way, the old Hero Public Safety Bureau had been generous. They had allotted more than enough funds to allow for retraining. He'd adapted. He'd used the skills he'd learned as an underground hero and had become a private investigator. Shoyuta had made sure he kept his cases simple. Things that wouldn't attract the wrong type of attention. He appeared to be fitting in. This was the longest case of his life. His red eyes bored into the image of Imoku. The man's green eyes were visible from under green curls over his confident smile. Representative Kakaridi was a man who knew his power. He didn't flaunt it, but he certainly used it. And he was adept at keeping it. He had won a second term by a landslide. Rumor had it that there had been serious debate in party rooms to decide if they should even bother running candidates against Imoku. He was very popular with his electorate. He was very popular with Japan. The major parties had run against him. It just made their loss all the more spectacular. But Imoku was only one man, and he had only one area, which should have limited his power. Aizawa snorted. Representative Kakaridi was very good at making sure all the major parties liked him. Somehow he hadn't made enemies in politics. Somehow. Shoyuta knew exactly how it was. And gift of a very expensive wine here, a vote of support there, a popular legislation in Kakaridi had enough political capital to spend, along with his very real fiscal capital. And he didn't have any dirt to dig up. Shoyuta knew he wasn't the only one looking. He had encountered others looking. Either the representative was as clean as he looked, or he was far better at burying his past than most others. Nezu had pointed him at Kakaridi, so Shoyuta knew exactly which option he leaned towards. It was somewhat scary to know that Nezu hadn't been able to work out Kakaridi, but Aizawa liked to think it was more that the principal didn't have time, rather than couldn't. The rat human was one of the casualties of the changes. He hadn't been killed, or taken for experimentation, he'd simply died. With Nezu's intelligence it was easy to forget he wasn't completely human. He'd aged and died. That was the easy path, really. Others hadn't made it quite as well. Snipe had settled into the police SWAT teams. He was their crack sharpshooter. Hizashi devoted himself full-time to radio. Midnight had launched a brand of perfume, but it hadn't done well. He wasn't sure where she was. Cementos worked in construction with Powerloader. Vlad King went in a completely different direction. Shoyuta understood he was working as an environmental consultant these days. Lunch Rush had opened a restaurant and Recovery Girl was retired but occasionally worked on difficult specialist cases when called in. 13 was working in the space program. It was slightly amusing, she was actually in space for a lot of the time, cleaning up the debris from the 20th century, which made clear space lanes for now. Most of UA's staff had moved on to find other work. It was the last thing Nezu did for them. Other schools weren't as adaptable. Ms. Joke had tried to work for the police and for a while she was a great hostage negotiator, but in the end that hadn't worked. She now did stand-up comedy with a quirk license. Those going to her shows knew she was using a quirk, but people wanted to laugh. He'd like to say that they wanted to laugh in these dark days, but society hadn't crumbled into shambles with the disappearance of heroes. It had changed, but it was still trundling along. As far as he knew, the League of Villains still existed, but they didn't appear as active. Unconfirmed rumor had it that many of the members indicated it wasn't as fun without heroes to fight. At least that meant the students, those who had been training to be heroes, weren't having to deal with them. Most of the students had moved into other courses, though the transition had been difficult for those who came from hero families. Uraraka had formed a business partnership with Powerloader and Cementos and was now one of the largest construction companies in Japan. Kirishima was with the police and was a frontline tactical expert for when they did confront quirk-related crime. It was the closest position to a combat hero that still existed. The support students were mostly in business for themselves. That was another thing Kakariri was responsible for. With the removal of heroes as a job, the restrictions on support items were lightened. The public had never been happier. And in some ways, Shoyuta was forced to admit it was a good thing. He had been on a stakeout a year or so ago now, and had spotted a mugging. He wasn't dumb enough to go and interfere. That would make him a vigilante and he had no desire to be imprisoned. But he had been willing to activate his quirk from a distance to render the attacker quirkless. No one would have seen him. It hadn't been necessary. The victim had pulled out something, he wasn't sure what it was given the distance and then had calmly walked away. On that front, Aizawa couldn't fault the change but he was curious to know how many were misusing support items to conduct heists. There was never any data on that. Perhaps he should ask Azui to collect it? She had taken a position with the Coast Guard, but had enough access to police records. Perhaps not, he had enough to complicate matters. He sighed again, and pulled some of the threads up. They had dropped off. They connected Imoku to the League of Villains. There was a connection, Shoyuta was sure of it but he wasn't quite sure how. The thread was gray to represent his questions. He was left staring at a knife. Aizawa stiffened. His mind automatically assessed the knife. It was a short throwing blade. It was embedded in the image of Imoku, directly between his green eyes, but thankfully had missed all the threads. Your situational awareness has gone down, Sensei. He blinked at the sentence. He knew that voice. Most of his students had gone into other industries. Some had become vigilantes. Most of them had been arrested or had stopped activities. They simply didn't have the contacts or drive to put up with the problems a vigilante faced. Not like some of the heroes, the ones who became vigilantes. They had more stamina in the business, at least until their former allies hunted them down. Aizawa didn't blame his students. They had signed up to be heroes after all, and that meant a certain amount of support. One had remained though. One who had left his class directly because of the assessments. Katsuki Bakugu. As far as Aizawa knew, Bakugu was living underground and was. You took out Compress? The boy, no longer a boy, the man snorted, and came fully into the space behind the boxes. Of course you did, Shoyuta answered his own question. You do know he was almost released? What? Katsuki glared. Aizawa had to admit his glare had gotten sharper over the years. You are a vigilante, he explained, and waited for Bakugu to put the pieces together. That's bullshit. He snarled. At least it wasn't accompanied by explosions. Those are the new rules. In the wake of the heroes being integrated, the rules on illegal use of quirks and vigilantism had been tightened. Children were now warned if they couldn't or didn't control their quirk once they turned 6. Those who simply couldn't control their quirks were given extra training. Those who didn't were put on suppressants, and it was up to the parents to ensure they were taken. Vigilantism carried penalties as harsh as if they were the perpetrators. Especially if the vigilante was a former pro-hero or student. There was now a recognized defense of wrongful arrest by vigilante. Compress hadn't managed to get away with that argument, but it was a close thing. Thankfully the league member had a rap sheet a mile long, and the prosecution had known to bring out every charge because quite a few had been dismissed. Yeah, well, you obviously don't agree with them, the blonde growled, reaching up to pull out his knife. He said nothing. Bakugu snorted again. I don't do blackmail, Sensei. Unless it is that fuck, he added. If a glare could set fire to something, without a quirk, Katsuki's would have. There was considerable venom in his eyes. You know something? I know that fucker's real name. That got Aizawa's attention. And he could see that it was meant to with the way Katsuki smirked at him. And what would that cost me? He asked carefully. Bakuga's statement guaranteed that Imoko Kakuridi had another name, but that didn't necessarily mean that he was doing anything illegal, though he could be. Depending on the circumstances, there might be a case for misleading Parliament, and that would be enough to get Kakuridi thrown out. It might not change the current rules regarding heroes back, but it would perhaps bring them into question. I want your assessment, Katsuki replied. My assessment? Shoyuta didn't understand. If the boy was talking about a psych assessment, there was no way to transfer them. Your realistic assessment, Bakugo explained before he huffed. I want to know if you think revealing it will do any good. You've always been good at knowing the consequences, Aizawa pointed out. The boy looked disgusted. Not with him, he whispered, glaring at the image. That was interesting. That meant there was some deeper history there. Tell me who he is, Aizawa said, agreeing to the price. It was something he'd have to do anyway, so he might as well get information. Bakugo nodded. His name is Izuku Midoriya, he said. The name meant nothing, though Aizawa was sure he had heard it before. He focused on Katsuki's words while his mind worked. He's my age. Or at least he's meant to be. Quirkless, and went missing about a year before this Kakuridi appears. Shoyuta took a deep breath, thinking. It would be very hard to prove, he murmured. Actually, it might be impossible unless this Izuku's DNA was on record, which it was. Blood work was done on all newborns in Japan. But getting a sample from Imoko would be difficult. Correction, legally getting the sample would be difficult, and then comparing it would actually violate several laws. And Kakuridi had enough lawyers that if there was the slightest hint of impropriety, he would bury them. And even if Imoko was this Izuku, what laws had he violated? Shoyuta wasn't sure. Misrepresentation was a possibility, but he was equally sure Imoko would have arguments against that. In fact, Imoko could argue that he was a victim of some quirk and had decided to make the best of his life. Except that didn't explain how he had walked into his directorships. Most of the companies had been groomed for him. Again, Aizawa could see that there would be reasons. The person who accidentally aged him felt sorry for him or similar. They were shallow reasons, but they would buy off the public. Except, why hadn't he told his real mother? Now that he was thinking, Aizawa felt his eyes wander to a picture of a green-haired woman who was almost always at Kakuridi's rallies. She was the mother of the missing quirkless Izuku Midoriya. Why had he been missing? No, there were questions that had to be answered, though. Shoyuta sighed. Well? Bakugo asked. I don't know, he replied. It would definitely cause some problems and raise quite a few questions which I'm sure Kakuridi doesn't want to answer, but I don't know how much trouble it would really raise. Why? Money, Shoyuta gave the short answer. And you know which companies he owns? The vigilante looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Kakuridi had an unfortunate interest in news and advertising. I'll take that as a yes. A couple of words to the right people and they won't publish. Even if they do, he can present himself as a victim of a quirk gone wild. Bullshit. True, Aizawa agreed. But he can spin stories to that effect, and I can guarantee that the reporting will favor him. So it's pointless? Not pointless, Shoyuta was quick to correct. Avalanches have to start somewhere. I just don't think revealing a supposed identity is enough. Finding a genuine link between him and the League would be better. Of course it fucking would. Bakugo growled. But you know he's not that careless. But you know him, Aizawa pointed out. Katsuki had knowledge of Izuku that he didn't, and that could be the difference. Though, how do you know it's him? There was a snort at the question. He fucking told me. He told you? There was an understandable note of disbelief in Aizawa's voice with his question. Bakugo's expression changed. It wasn't something Shoyuta would ever expected to see on the blonde's face. It was a mix of emotion. Regret, resignation, even fear. There was definite history here. He told me. Shoyuta took a deep breath, before he reached back one hand, feeling for some boxes. He hoisted himself into a sitting position on them after checking that they would hold his weight. Start at the beginning, he instructed. Assume I know nothing, he added. What else had Imoku told Bakugo? Did Bakugo know about Imoku's undocumented quirk? The representative hadn't exactly denied having one, but, as always with Kakuriti, proof was scarce to non-existent. And making an accusation of that nature would require irrefutable proof, especially as Kakuriti had been correct. Government representatives were routinely checked to ensure that they were not being influenced by a quirk. He suppressed his shiver. That was not a good memory. Not the interview with Kakuriti, one of his students. Shinso. He should be there. In the government testing team. Too young, they said. Too inexperienced. He'd instead taken a job with the police as a hostage negotiator, and he'd been good. He'd proven to the world that his quirk could be used for good. Until someone set a trap. He couldn't be sure it was the League, but it seemed like them. One of the hostages wasn't a hostage. At least it had been quick. It was a comfort Aizawa didn't like to think about. He couldn't prove it was the League, but the way the woman had smirked made it clear. Shinso wasn't a hero, but they wanted him gone. It starts back when I was 4, Katsuki said, bringing Shuta's attention back to the present. The vigilante had taken a seat on another set of boxes and was staring into the distance. We were so excited to get our quirks, Bakugo murmured. But he never did. It wasn't too bad at first. It could be just late, but it never came. Eventually he was diagnosed as quirkless. He has the toe joint and everything. Aizawa nodded, indicating he was listening. Bakugo sighed. I wasn't good to him, he said. There was a catch in his voice. That barely covers it. I was a villain to him, he altered his words. Every opportunity one could I told him he was worthless. Every chance I had, I used my quirk on him. No one bothered to stop it. I was gifted after all. There was a bitter note in Katsuki's words. It wasn't all directed outwards. That was a change. 10 years. I never thought about it. I never wondered, I just did it because there's no way someone without a quirk was going to get in my way. No way someone without a quirk would ever be a hero. I wasn't going to let the spotlight fall on him. Shoyuta said nothing. This was new, but he had gained a reasonable insight into Bakugo's nature during the first year of UA. He was passionate. That was the kindest way of saying it. Then one day, when we were 14, our teacher was asking about our high school choices. The extras all wanted to be heroes, but they knew they couldn't. Only I was applying to UA. At least, that's what I thought. Then I found out he was. I was so angry. Here was this quirkless nothing, trying to get into UA. Something snapped. I just wanted him to hurt, so I told him that if he wanted to be a hero that badly, he should just jump off the roof, and believe he'd be born with a quirk in the next life. Aizawa saw the way Bakugo swallowed thickly. His red eyes were still unfocused. Izuku didn't jump, he just disappeared. Katsuki huffed. The last thing I told him was that he should kill himself, and in disappearing he kind of did. There was a search. Nothing was found. No evidence, no phone, no nothing. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. Shoyuta couldn't say he was familiar with the case, but he nodded. Missing person cases were very much like that, perhaps without the words spoken by Bakugo. That doesn't tell me why you believe Imoku was Izuku, he pointed out. Only 4 people heard the words I said to him. Izuku, 2 extras, and myself. But Imoku repeated them to me. What do you mean? Aizawa could tell he was missing something here. The vigilante huffed. I was pissed when I was dropped from the hero program. That was putting it mildly. It took me more than a few years to realize why I'd failed. Before I figured it out, I blamed the punk who'd brought in the heroes must be heroes bill. Kakarite, Shoyuta supplied. Yeah, that fucker. So I confronted him. He didn't take me seriously. He waved off his bodyguards, so I attacked. He was faster and he did something so I couldn't use my quirk. At that, Aizawa's eyebrow raised. He was willing to say that Kakarite had a second quirk, but it was not anything like that. It had to be something related to mind control. Bakugo caught his expression. His quirk is spark. He stopped my ignition sparks, he explained. But then he leaned in close to me and whispered. He repeated the words I'd said to Izuku. Word for word, Sensei. He got it perfect. There is no way a 40-year-old politician should know those words. The only way for him to know them is if he is Izuku. Most people would dismiss the idea of a 14-year-old becoming a 40-year-old and somehow entering politics. Aizawa wasn't most people. What day did he disappear? Katsuki named a date. Shoyuta looked at his board. It was before Imoku took over the companies he owned. It was before he made a run to be a representative. There was time to modify him, or for someone to learn. So you think someone took this Izuku, gave him a spark quirk, aged him up and then put him into politics? Bakugo gave him a look. He was aware of how insane it sounded. Not someone. That quirk-stealing bastard. But there's 2 more proof points, he replied, not bothering to directly answer the question. USJ. Unless you know something I don't, it was never revealed who that other person was, but I remember, he had green hair under the mask. Aizawa nodded. That was true, and to this day no one was sure who that person had been. He hadn't been a kid, that much was certain. But no one that they had ever seen with the League met the description, and no one cared that much to remain hidden. And the last point? The last thing that bastard said before he died. What was that? Shoyuta asked. He knew the villain who had founded the League was dead. It had been reported quietly. He had died in custody from wounds inflicted by All Might. What everyone remembered was that All Might had retired because of that fight. Nothing more. Yagi was pleased, but didn't say anything publicly. It would have been too easy to portray it as gloating, and despite his reputation as a flawless hero, All Might was still under scrutiny. Izuku. Shoyuta blinked. How do you know that? You pay off the right people, they'll tell you anything. Especially little things they think are worthless. That was true. Him saying Izuku doesn't mean Kakarite is your old schoolmate. Except it's the only theory that fits all the evidence. He's the only man who could have given Izuku the darn spark quirk. From what I know of him, he had other quirks. They could have aged the fucker, and he had contacts. All Might told me that. Imoku Kakarite is Izuku Midoriya. And instead of being a hero, he's destroyed them. Shoyuta was silent for a few minutes. It was unfortunately the only theory that fitted all the evidence. He looked at his board. There were so many links and cross-links to Imoku. He was the linchpin. If he was gone then. The former underground hero didn't know. He wasn't sure what might happen if Imoku was to disappear. A lot had happened already and he well knew that things tended to coast on inertia for a while. You know, he said slowly as a kernel of an idea formed. I think we might be going about this the wrong way. What do you mean? Bakugo demanded. Aizawa ran his eyes over his board. What does it matter who Imoku really is? He murmured the question, still thinking. Because he's a fucking useless Deku. No, Shoyuta objected. What does it really matter? Even if we find evidence to prove it, what does it matter? Katsuki remained silently fuming. It's not Izuku that we are fighting, it's Imoku Kakarite. Proving he is Izuku won't change anything because I'm willing to bet there will be those who support him with excuses for the name he's using. Adoption, change of name, whatever it takes. Someone has gone to a lot of trouble to ensure Imoku is in position, and you can bet they've covered contingencies. What we need to focus on is what we can do to stop Imoku, because really, what does it matter if he's Izuku? It's a distraction. Bakugo didn't look convinced. Aizawa remembered that he could be like a dog with a bone. He'd keep worrying it until it was gone. If we prove Imoku was Izuku, what will the public do? Shoyuta posed the question. I don't know. That's why I was asking you. That single statement was enough for Aizawa to realize how much Bakugo had changed. There will be some who care, but he's got the money and backing to ensure the story is quickly buried. The consequences will go to other people. He gave Katsuki a significant look. The consequences would come to them, and to the poor saps that Imoku got to take the fall, because there was no doubt in the former underground probe hero's mind that Imoku would get someone to take the fall. There was a reluctant nod. In the meantime, he's shoring up his position and making how many more problems for us. So that's why I say we've been doing this the wrong way. Who cares if Imoku was Izuku? We already know he's Imoku, and it's Imoku we need to stop. He looked back at his board, fixing his eyes on the section that had the pictures of the League of Villains. They were still active. Their commanders were still out there, and more powerful than ever, but strangely quiet. Bakugo huffed and followed his teacher's gaze. I get it. If we can prove that Imoku has a link to the League, or anyone else, then that will cause him problems. And it's a problem the public will care about more than something he could swing to bring sympathy to his cause. The fucker would spin some sob story, Katsuki growled. Aizawa nodded. I'd also like to focus on his quirk. That spark thing? I figured out a way around it. No, Shoyuta shook his head. He has spark, but I'm positive he has a second quirk. Bakugo looked intrigued. I don't know what it does, Aizawa shared. After all, Katsuki had told him about Izuku. I'm convinced it has something to do with persuasion. A second quirk is a bigger claim than identity, the vigilante pointed out. He acknowledged that. I still think he has it. No one really questioned the old guy after he was incarcerated. Those that did, well, they didn't like it, and it didn't seem important at the time. I think he has something undetectable but powerful. Why? He couldn't answer, it was just a feeling. You know, a couple of party representatives retired at the last election? That had been a few years back now. There was another election on the horizon. Bakugo rolled his eyes but nodded. Off-the-record interviews with them indicate that they are a bit confused about some of the legislation they voted for. They're not senile? It was a fair question. Japan's government representatives were generally very old. Ancient was probably a better term. Aizawa felt his lips quirk in a half-smile. No, they aren't. So you think that's a quirk wearing off? Maybe, he confirmed. It might be nothing but Shoyuta paused, sighing deeply. The change has been too fast, too controlled. It was too widely supported in government given how wide-reaching it was to be. That fucker. Katsuki growled. Fucker might have used it on me. You agreed with him? Not immediately, but I felt like I should. Maybe, Aizawa assessed before he shrugged. It was probably years back and Bakugo was contentious anyway. There wouldn't be any lingering effects. So, what do you know about them? He asked, before Katsuki could degenerate into cursing. He pointed a finger towards the League section of the board. Bakugo looked at the pictures. Moonfish got taken out a year or so ago, he said immediately. What? Aizawa hadn't heard anything about that. It's not official. The body was too badly damaged, but the teeth were his. I'm guessing they couldn't control him. You're certain it was him? Positive, Katsuki confirmed. Shoyuta slid off the boxes and got a black marker out. He put an edge around the villain's image. It was his marker for death. Missed bastard, they are keeping close. I haven't even heard a whisper of where he might be for ages. The fucking league has a new teleporter. That wasn't good. Aizawa just nodded. He knew some of this. No one had seen Kurogiri for a while. There was even speculation that he was dead, but no one was willing to say it. A warp quirk was too rare, even in the underworld, for anyone to just kill him without a very good reason. Though if they had a new teleporter. Except, as far as Shoyuta knew, Kurogiri was the oldest member of the league. He'd always been a member since its founding. It would be a big thing to kill him. There's a couple of things happening in Hakodate that makes me think the bitch is there, Bakugo continued, pointing towards Himiko Toga. I don't know where Twice is, but he's running some sort of snuff ring. Shoyuta gave Katsuki a look. Snuff rings never lasted. The body count was too high and they were hunted down. He copies a prostitute, the vigilante shrugged. Oh, that made sense but was rather sickening. Twice copied the prostitute and some sicko got off on killing them, except it wasn't really killing. Aizawa didn't like the thought. He made a mental note to mention it to some of his police contacts. Mustard and Spinner are around in Dabi. Not sure where he is, but he's the acting boss. And those Numu things? They'll be with Dabi, unless they destroyed them. Shoyuta nodded. That was a sensible conclusion. Those things could not be easy to control. And they are all being relatively quiet, he commented. When the heroes were forced to integrate, the one thing that might have changed public sentiment was villain attacks. There were remarkably few. The League did nothing. He didn't think they had that restraint, but they had. They had simply watched, never showing themselves as the heroes were destroyed. Even after they didn't seem to celebrate. The only incident came just after the government had voted to abolish heroes as a profession. Tomura Shigaraki's body, missing both hands, and with his throat slashed from ear to ear, was delivered to Mineta Minoru's residence, with a sorry note attached. The boy hadn't seen it. He couldn't see it given he was still missing his face, but the gesture had not gone unnoticed. And Tomura's hands had never been found. There'd been speculation for a while on what that meant, but eventually word had come through enough unofficial sources that Dabi was the acting leader of the league. There was still no word as to who the official leader was. Shoyuta thought it was Imoku. So did Bakugo. Neither could prove it. They are. I keep waiting for the other shoe to fall, but nothing ever happens. Then I think it's time they were found, Aizawa said. Especially Dabi, he added. You think he'll talk? He fixed his eyes on the image. There was a thick line connecting him to Imoku, but Shoyuta thought about what he knew of Dabi, Tuya Todoroki. The villain had matured over the years but still had a bad habit of liking to show off. The interview he'd given to out his father was the prime example, but there were other smaller ones. Reports that while he was in combat where he liked to reveal information he didn't have to. It had been a couple of years, but they could play on that and there was fair chance Dabi would say something he shouldn't in an effort to be clever. It might sound like a long shot, but it was better than no shot. I think Dabi wants to be acknowledged, Aizawa explained his reasoning. Katsuki caught on immediately. He had never been dumb. I'm already looking into him. The blonde leaned forward, looking at the board. He does the fighting rings, Aizawa reminded Katsuki. Bakugo gave him a look. And what do I do? The former underground hero nodded, getting the gist of the matter. Katsuki was a brawler. He'd entered the fighting rings. Probably not here in Tokyo. He might be too well known here, but Dabi ran them across Japan. There would be rings in other cities. Bakugo would go through them. The question dismissed the matter, and Aizawa watched Katsuku's red eyes travel over the links. Anyone else who is dead? You've already marked them, came the murmured reply before Shoyuta saw Katsuki frown. Is that accurate? He asked, pointing to one of the links. Yes, Jiren is definitely in a relationship with Pop Step. Business relationship, he quickly clarified. The female vigilante had been around for years and had still not been caught. But she did tend to stick to minor cases. The blonde nodded and gave him a grin. Then I have a secondary lead on Dabi. Aizawa allowed himself a snort of amusement but suppressed any excitement. He reached out to the boards, picking them up so that he could replace the false wall. Bakugo slid off his seat of boxes and helped as they placed them. Same time next week? Aizawa murmured. The vigilante gave him a nod. I'll find you, he said before slipping through the boxes and away. Shoyuta didn't huff, but he felt a stab of resentment. Well, of course he didn't mean they should meet here. That would be too obvious. Anyone would think he was the amateur. Kurogiri looked around the bar. He kept it for old time's sake. And for the times when the league managed to get together like tonight. It was closed to the public. The door was locked and there was a sign on it indicating that the facility had been hired for a private function so they wouldn't have any morons attempting to come in. Their underlings knew better than to bother them today, and with Imoku here, that was for the best. He was the boss, but he was the hidden boss. People knew he existed. Dabi admitted he reported to someone, but no one knew who he was. With the information Imoku provided them with, it lent the league an air of mystique and power. So much had changed, yet so much remained the same. The jokes about his beer, for example, hadn't changed, but the league had. In the wake of the historic vote on heroes, Tomura had wanted the league to run wild. Imoku had wanted the league to lay low so that the vote wasn't overturned. In that, Imoku had the better view of reality. They fought. Imoku won. Kurogiri looked to the spot in the bar where Tomura had died. The wood boards were spotless. His bar was always clean, but he could see where Shigaraki's blood had been spilt. As far as he was aware, it was the first and only fight the two of them had. And Imoku was the one who was prepared. Not surprising given Sensei's training. Though, the interesting thing to note was that while the league had followed Imoku in the heat of the moment, they had actually been on Tomura's side. They did want to run wild, to prove to the world that villains had won. Imoku had kept them under control, and he'd done it in a way that Kurogiri never expected. He gave them jobs. Not meaningless make work either. They were actual jobs, and Imoku let them keep the profits. Given that all the jobs had an aspect of villainy to them, the profits were large. It had kept them all docile for the last few years. He, along with Ujiko, was running a delivery service. A very discreet, very efficient one that transported all sorts of goods around the country, through customs or whatever else he was paid for. Drugs arrived in a container. They were never even unpacked, and there was nothing but residue for customs to find, and in shipping containers, there was always residue. High-end clients, those who couldn't be seen going to a dealer, provided coordinates, and their poison, whatever it was delivered exactly there. He didn't even have to leave the bar. Spinner was his contact, and made sure that he got paid, and that he got a cut. Spinner was working as an agent for a lot of them, helping them out with contacts. Jiren was still doing that as well, but the man had distanced himself from them slightly. The new environment meant he could now openly sell support items. Jiren might be close to being legitimate these days. Kurogiri wasn't sure. Twice was actually working 2 jobs, one for himself, in stuff porn, and one for Dabi. He had the advantage over other producers, and Kurogiri knew there were others, but no one could output the volume Twice was. They didn't have his advantages. He simply got someone, women usually, but sometimes men, trans, bi, it didn't matter. They all wanted out of the industry. Twice was prepared to arrange that. They paid him to die. Of course they didn't really die. Getting rid of the bodies was such a pain. Twice duplicated them, and they were killed on screen. It meant he could put out a lot of films, while his victims moved on to something new. That was the deal. But the death, the bit those who watched that sort of stuff really wanted, that was real, even if it was just a clone. Mustard was working with a company Kurogiri suspected Imoku had purchased specifically for the league member. They were making sleeping pills, using the gas he created. It was condensed and solidified, and apparently it worked on almost anyone. Being the source of the drug, Mustard got a significant cut of the profits. The boy was happy and sent in sealed bottles every week as his work, but did what he wanted in the meantime. Kurogiri suspected that Imoko's company had figured out how to synthesize Mustard's gas since the volume they produced was far more than he did, but Imoko was happy to pay him to keep him quiet. Dabi and Toga worked together, though Kurogiri wasn't quite sure what Toga did. Dabi was the main contact for the league and he ran an underground fighting ring. All were welcome, and High End was his ultimate undefeated champion. Twice was called in sometimes, if the combatant was feeling wussy. He cloned them and generally they died. The underground didn't like that, but a new fighter could sometimes get away with using twice to build confidence. It was actually Dabi who had to deal with the most bodies. He carboniced most of them. Everyone was kept active. Those who joined the league later reported to them, and they all got paid. And they had all been quiet. Kurogiri admired the way Izuku had handled that. It made the reason for Tomura's death all the more clear. Though Izuku was still involved. The bartender looked over at the corner. The representative had gotten away for tonight and was sitting in the corner Tomura had favored. He was nursing a beer, but Kurogiri could tell from the way his green eyes were moving, he wasn't missing a thing. Being here, casually, allowed the league to bring their complaints and concerns to him directly. It helped him maintain control. Though, the Numus did that as well. Kurogiri had thought that High End was only loyal to Sensei and Tomura. Izuku had spent a few minutes with the Numu and High End would have then followed the politician around like a puppy. What Imoko wanted, High End was more than happy to provide. Like a toddler following after a parent, looking for approval. That's why High End was working with Dabi. The Numu wanted to fight. Imoko had arranged the initial battles and it satisfied High End that no one was allowed to challenge him unless they had proven to be the strongest. It made Dabi's fighting ring one of the most prized in the country. Underground, of course. Kurogiri nodded when Imoku raised his chin. He poured a new beer and went over to Imoku. Dabi was sitting with him. The fire villain grinned at him. "It's time to run wild," Dabi announced. Just a tad too loudly. The bar turned to them. Imoko gave Dabi a disparaging look. The villain didn't even look contrite. Soon, Imoko told the league, as Toga bounced up and down happily. "There's just one vigilante I want taken care of first." "Boss. If that's all you want, why didn't you say so earlier?" "We'll take out a vigilante," Spinner said, almost laughing. Imoko smiled at him. Kurogiri knew that smile. He braced. "Explodo kill," the representative said. "Fuck." The expletive was somewhat universal around the bar. Explodo kill was one of the most problematic vigilantes. He had a very strong quirk, and was quick-witted. Not only that, he was tough. He could take a hit unlike others, and he absolutely did not play by the rules, or give a fuck about public opinion. Tomura hadn't been completely delusional when he decided to ask the brat to be a villain. Except Explodo Kill was still trying to be a hero, in a society that didn't want them. "I'm sure you all want to avenge Compress," Imoko pressed, mercilessly. Dabi held up 2 fingers. The tip of each was decorated with a blue flame. Imoko smiled at it. Oh, he wanted to avenge Compress. But Kogu had done himself no favors there. On this, Izuku told the league, "You can go wild, but I want you to make it very clear to bystanders that you are only targeting Explodo Kill." "I'll do that," Toga yelled happily. She had done it in the past. She took on the appearance of a civilian and mingled with those watching any fight. Her comments made sure that those watching knew what the league was trying to do. There was something about hearing things in the heat of the moment that made it all the more believable, and it stuck in the memory. "You aren't going to give us a plan?" Spinner asked. "It's one vigilante," Imoko replied. I think you can handle that. The green villain managed to look slightly contrite. Your plans are the best, boss, he said. That got a chuckle. Then I'll score yours, Imoku countered. Spinner flushed. It looked odd against his skin, but the League understood the message. While Imoku would do his best for them, and was the boss, what good were they if they could not operate independently? Imoku looked around the bar. I know, in the wake of the vote, some of you wanted to follow Tomura, wanted to run wild then, to prove to the world our victory. I do thank you for sticking with me, because I know the path hasn't been easy. After Explodo Kill is taken out, you may run wild as you like. Or you can continue in the jobs you've been doing for the last few years. He gave them all a grin, gesturing to himself. I won't judge. That brought a laugh. Imoku was dressed in what had to be an expensive suit, but his jacket was over the back of the seat, and his tie was stuffed into the front pocket. There were several buttons undone on his shirt. Anyone looking into the bar would know he was the boss from the casual way he wore his suit. Also through elimination. Everyone else was relatively well known. He was the only unknown face, at least in their circles. It's going to be your choice, and I'll meet with you all when the time comes. In the meantime, taking out Explodo Kill will remove the last risk to returning to a life of traditional villainy. Kurogiri didn't comment on the fact that Imoku's smile was a tad mocking at that. The League was now engaged in traditional villainy, if you went to a time before quirks. What about Lemillion? Twice asked. No, don't worry. Over the years, while Imoku had not always been present, he was sufficiently versed in each of the League's idiosyncrasies. Lemillion had been a hero, but in the aftermath of a mission led by Tomura, one where a quirk-destroying bullet aimed for him had been intercepted by Sir Night-Eye, he had failed the newly mandated psychological assessment. Counseling had only gone so far, and with the vote that led to the reintegration of heroes into society, he had joined the police in a desk position, though he was occasionally called upon in odd cases where his phasing ability was an advantage. Obviously, being able to phase through a wall, or into a safe, was a good way of seeing what was there without actually going through the lock. However, rumors had it that Lemillion was leading a faction advocating for the return of heroes. He was running on that platform, hoping to be elected to the House of Representatives. Much like Izuku had. I'll deal with him, Imoku said. There were dark inflections there. The League heard them. Most grinned. Imoku had been around often enough for them to learn a few things about their boss, and when he spoke like that, the problem was as good as gone. Now, drink up, while I have a chat with Dabi, Imoku said, sitting back down. The League toasted him, but there was a noticeable gap now between them and the table. Toga bounced over and sat down, her back to the rest of the League, blocked their view, and that completed their illusion of privacy. I never thought you'd mention Tomura, Kurogiri murmured. Izuku gave him a half-smile. I never hated him, he said. That got him some odd looks. Toga giggled. You did, Izu. No, I didn't, Imoku objected mildly with a smile. I understood Tomura, he continued. I know exactly why Sensei chose him to lead the League. You did? Dabi asked, glancing towards the place Tomura had died. Toga just giggled. Kurogiri would admit to being curious as well. In the beginning it had seemed as if Tomura would never mature, but over time he had become better, more skilled at leadership. But he had never truly worked out what Sensei had seen in the petulant, selfish, spoiled boy. I did. Tomura was gifted, Imoku explained, before finishing off his beer. He took the new beer Kurogiri had brought over and took a long pull. Is that what you want to call it? Dabi snorted. Oh, he was, Imoku defended the dead former leader. We all lash out when we are angry, but there is a limit. We will all fight, and we will destroy things, but again, there is a limit. A point at which we stop. You see it every day, Dabi. The fighters you take. Not the newbies and not high-end. The seasoned fighters. Even when angry, they know when to stop so that they don't kill someone, don't they? The fire villain nodded, his scarred face thoughtful. I guess, though it's also because they know it's a pain to get rid of the bodies, and I'll dock their pay. Imoku chuckled. There's that, he allowed. Alright, let's take a domestic dispute or something like that. There's a lot of hitting involved, even in passion, but there isn't a lot of death. That's what I mean. People hold back. Sometimes they make mistakes and someone dies, but it's not normal, it's not what they wanted. How does that connect to Hanzi? Toga asked. He didn't have those limits, or any sense of restraint. He went for the kill, every time. And he didn't regret it. Kurogiri nodded. He'd lived the most through Izuku's words. It was a petty thing, but not once did Tomura apologize for anything. Not the disintegrated controllers, or the piles of dust left over when he disintegrated some random customer who looked at him wrong. We do go for the kill, Dabi objected. He was obviously remembering when they had trapped Kamui Woods. The plant-based hero had burned. When it's planned, Izuku told him. But it was more than that. Tomura would tear down society, bring anarchy to the world and never worry about where his next meal was coming from. The rest of us will be a bit concerned. And that single-minded drive is actually harder to find than you'd believe. Again Kurogiri nodded. Sensei had searched for quite some time before finding Tomura. Not that he had been obvious about it, but there had been an air about the man that was satisfied when he found Tomura. Part of it was the corruption of the grandchild of his former nemesis, but a part of it was that Tomura was suited. But if that was the case, and Imoku understood what Sensei wanted, then why had he killed Tomura? He hadn't raised the knife himself, but he had created the circumstances and given the order. So why? The mist villain realized the question had slipped out before he could stop himself. Imoku looked at him, green eyes weighing him, just for a moment. His expression changed, becoming amusedly resigned. I guess I never explained, did I? You haven't, Dabi answered for the bartender. Imoku nodded. Tomura was what was needed to tear down society. In that, every time he failed, he would simply try again, until he succeeded. Me being there helped on the timeline, but that was Tomura's job. He just never thought of what would happen next. And since he refused to listen, he died. Toga trilled happily. He did, Izuku agreed. That is true, Kurogiri said, referring to Imoku's earlier explanation. I do sometimes remember him as the one Sensei chose, he added. Izuku was mature enough to know he meant nothing from it. He'd made his choice on that fateful day because he wasn't stupid. He knew that Izuku would have had plans on how to take any of them league out, if they objected to the change in leadership. You forget then, Kurogiri, Sensei chose me as well. Izuku's eyes were hard. His voice was chilly. He did, the mist villain agreed amicably. Izuku was mature enough to know he wouldn't challenge, but there were things best left to when they were truly private. He did. They sat in silence for a few moments. Toga fidgeted, while Imoku took another drink of beer. You wanted to talk to me? Dabi said, finally breaking the slight tension. It was best to move on to a new topic. I did, Izuku said, his voice back to being completely pleasant. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and resting his head on his clasped hands. Has anyone heard anything about Carrie? He asked. The three league members shared a glance with each other. Toga was easy to read. She had no idea what was going on. Dabi looked at Kurogiri, one burned eyebrow rising slightly. Kurogiri heard the most of them. The mist villain shook his head slightly to indicate he didn't know. Dabi nodded shallowly. I've only ever heard of it in relation to Yatsu's case, he said finally. Who's Yatsu? Toga chimed in. One of my ex-underlings, Dabi explained. He was killed in remand. And you did nothing about it? Kurogiri asked. Killing a member of the league got retribution, especially if they were in remand, where they should have been safe. Izuku snorted. What he said, Dabi told the mist villain. The laugh meant there was a story and that Imoku had decided retribution wasn't necessary. He had a minor restraint quirk, Dabi explained. It was sometimes useful, but he just couldn't stay clean, the fire villain added. Himiko laughed. It wasn't like they were clean. He kept assaulting women and expecting the League to bail him out, Imoku explained. And being in prison interferes with my work, Dabi added. I heard about Kerry in relation to his case, but I never looked into it, he explained further. So what is query, Izu? Toga asked. Kerry, Izuku corrected. When it was used on Warui, it was quirk experimental remove dash. Kurojiri didn't hear any more. He knew what Izuku was going to say. Maybe not the exact words, but he knew the meaning. You copied it, he whispered. Izuku waved his free hand. Overhaul was not discreet, he sounded disgusted. Kerry is the first working version. You copied it? Kurojiri repeated his question. Dabi was tapping at his phone. It says Biosimap Industries developed it for the Department of Justice, he told the warp villain. Kurojiri had never heard of them. Biosimap Industries is owned by Yakuhin, which is owned by Citic, which is owned by Dash. Kuinshu, Imoku said. You did develop it, Kurojiri said. Kuinshu was the main company Izuku ran. As a company it was quite small, but its holdings were diverse and powerful. Overhaul was not discreet, Izuku repeated, sounding slightly defensive. There were at least 5 test versions we beat out by making ours first. And, there are advantages to me making it, he added. He reached under the table and pulled something out of his pants pocket. Kurojiri couldn't see what it was. 5 test versions? That was too many. Once quirk removal became known, it's too valuable a tool to ignore, Imoku shrugged. There was the military version, the very underfunded police version, one from a university research group and 2 other commercial lots. Mine was better than them all. Hardly surprising. You had the bullets, Toga reminded him. And one was used on Overhaul, Izuku reminded her. She knew it. She'd been there. And the other was used for this, Kurojiri concluded. Mostly, Izuku agreed. He pulled his hand back from what he'd placed on the table. It was a small vial. But, as I said, there are advantages to me making it, he repeated. Advantages? Dabi asked for them all. Green eyes stared at Kurojiri. After what I've been through, you don't think I would allow someone to destroy everything, do you? It was a reference to the past. Dabi didn't understand. Toga didn't either. Kurojiri did. Though, even after all this time, he did not understand it all. But he knew Izuku was referring to a time before he joined the League. Wait. Izuku had been quirkless before Sensei gave him 2 quirks. And Kurojiri still wasn't entirely sure what the second one did, but over the years, he had made some educated guesses. It was something to do with persuasion. That wasn't the point. Izuku wouldn't let anyone take them away from him. Not even a drug designed to do that. No, you won't, Kurojiri replied, looking at the vial. He wasn't sure if it was an inhibitor or a cure. Dabi and Himiko still didn't understand. Kurojiri remained silent, allowing Izuku to explain. The politician opened the vial and tipped it over. 3 pills spilled onto the table. There is only one advantage worth noting, Izuku told them. When Kerry was used on Warui, it was experimental, now it isn't. The words are now Quirk Emergency Removal Initiative, and the government will be authorizing the use those who repeatedly use their quirks in violence against others. All 3 of the villains swallowed at that news. Even Himiko, and she was usually unaffected by everything. Over the years she had mellowed somewhat. Kurojiri was calmer, but he knew what the pills represented. And the advantage? Dabi asked, staring at the pills. It almost seemed as if he wanted to burn them. I know how to block its effects. What? Himiko breathed. Kurogiri nodded. Izuku had said that much earlier. I know how to block its effects. Carry is effective only on those I want it to be effective on, Imoka said with a sly grin. Those are inhibitors. While I have absolutely no intentions of letting carry into the general populace, I want to be prepared, so take your medicine. Dabi grabbed one of the pills. Himiko wasn't far behind him. Kurogiri moved more slowly. He had more dignity, but he swallowed the pill. What about the others? Dabi indicated softly. Which ones? Imoku asked. Dabi thought for a moment. He knew what Imoku was asking. Just as Imoku planned that no one but his company would use carry, the cure couldn't become widely known, and it absolutely could not be known that the League was immune. Twice, Spinner and Ijiko, Dabi said. Not mustard? Dabi shook his head. I think he likes profit, the fire villain said, making a face. You manipulated us. He made the mock accusation. Of course I did, Imoku replied without any hint of embarrassment. But you knew I was, and it's not like you haven't enjoyed the results. At that Dabi was silent, because it was true. He did enjoy being one of the most, if not the most respected villain in the country. It was mostly because, even if he wasn't, everyone assumed he was overseeing all the League's various underground endeavors. That meant he got credit for controlling Kurogiri when he removed those 4 tons of drugs from the docks. He got credit for every time some chick died gruesomely with what Twice was doing. He got it all. But it wasn't him. It was Imoku. Who would have thought that work agreed with us? The politician grinned. It was an amusing question. Most people didn't appreciate how much work being a villain really was. He had just harnessed them to jobs they liked. Dabi gave Imoku a grin. It was partially true, but while he got the credit, he knew Imoku was still ahead of him. He was like his father that way. Imoku was always ahead, but unlike Endeavor, Imoku never really drove it home, not that Dabi had ever considered mutiny. Not seriously, but he knew, Imoku had definitely kept enough of the key people loyal to him, and him alone. Kurogiri was loyal. Dabi had been surprised at that. He would have thought Kurogiri loyal to Tomura, but Imoku had worked his magic there. Ujiko was loyal. Well, she was loyal to her businesses, but he knew she'd chose Imoku over him. The Warpers were loyal to the politician. Dabi knew he could convince Twice, Mustard and Spinner to follow him. Maybe Toga. No, not Toga, he could convince most of the rank and file, but the big hitters, the really big hitters, the Numu and the Warpers would follow Imoku. If it came to a fight, his only chance was to strike preemptively. Not that he would. Imoku had given him everything he'd ever wanted with the fall of Endeavor. He'd never even have thought about just revealing everything. He had wanted some sort of fight where he won and revealed himself at the end, but what had happened, so much better. So much sweeter. He'd played along that it had been part of his plan to Tomura, but it had been Imoku's. Oh yes, he owed him, and Imoku knew it. Apparently he owed him even more now. I'll leave extra doses on my coffee table, Imoku agreed, looking at Kurogiri. He knew what to do. He'd pick them up tomorrow. I sold that stuff to the government on the grounds that it will keep society in check. It is for use on repeat offenders, but I also convinced them that there should be no pre-existing list of offenders. Good. Dabi said. There was no relief in his voice. He was just that type of man. You can't give us some for Explodo kill? I don't think so. At the moment Carrie is still quiet. The sheeple haven't realized it's out there, and I'd like to keep it that way. He won't keep his trap shut, and since you are going for a kill, it shouldn't matter. Tell high-end Explodo kill will put up a good fight. Dabi groaned. Problems? The usual, he breathed. Kurogiri knew what that meant. High-end was loyal, but high-end craved combat. He loved fighting, and while being the champion in Dabi's fighting ring meant he did get challengers, seldom did they actually put up any kind of decent fight against the Numu. I have a free hour in 3 days' time, I'll talk to him then. Thanks, Dabi actually meant the word. High-End was loyal to Imoko and liked to spend time with the man. It was probably the only time High-End wasn't looking for a fight. Actually, I'll give you a dose for High-End as well, Imoka said slowly. Not the others? It wasn't like the Numu were in danger of blabbing any secrets. Izuku appeared to think for a moment, but Kurogiri could tell his mind was already made up. No, I don't think so. The 3 league members nodded. The Numu were useful, but at the same time they could be difficult. It might be interesting to see if a quirk removal agent affected them. We might have problems with them soon, Dabi murmured. Problems? Imoku asked for clarification. I don't think they are as lively as they should be, the fire villain gave the explanation slowly. Imoku snorted. The Numus were individuals who had forcibly been altered. Their creators had assured him they felt no pain, but he wasn't convinced of that. He was convinced of very little when it came to the Numu. Keep watch, and let me know if things change. Dabi nodded. Do you regret Tomura not killing Overhaul sooner? Kurogiri asked, moving them back to a different topic. It seemed it was a day to focus on the past. Not really, Imoku answered easily. If he'd been killed in the initial raid, then things might have been different. The moment he got away, then this was inevitable. What raid? Dabi demanded. He knew Overhaul was the original source of quirk-destroying drugs, but he hadn't heard of any raid. Izuku looked at the quasi-leader of the league. You weren't involved, he told the fire villain. Nor were you, Himiko, he added. Tomura only used those who were truly in the league, not those who might have followed Stain. And this raid? Toga asked. The politician shrugged. It destroyed most of the stock of Overhaul's drug and the source was killed. The source? Carrie is different. It's synthesized. Overhaul's drug was based on the quirk of a girl named Eri. He used her blood to make his bullets. She's dead. Tomura ensured that, but I thought it a nice homage to use her name, Izuku explained. Who else knows? Kurogiri asked. He'd never known the name of the child, but if Izuku knew, that meant others would as well. Unofficially, Overhaul gave his bullets to the government, who gave them to the police, who gave them to heroes, before the League stole them. He gave the government an explanation, including the girl's name. The report he gave very much blames the League for her death. Kurogiri said nothing. They had killed her. He made it seem like he was some kind father figure to her, but we all know that wasn't true. Still, that is the past. Those who know the name, know why I named this Carrie. Since they believe any member of the League who was captured, will be tried, and if Carrie used on them, they think it is a fine honor. Overhaul wasn't clear on who actually killed her. I suspect he never knew. I don't know either, Kurogiri admitted. He knew it was the League, but he didn't know exactly who killed her. I think it was Tomura, Izuku said. Her remains were mostly dust. There's no chance he didn't. Dabi didn't complete the sentence. He didn't like the idea of killing children, which was why he hadn't been included on the first mission. None at all, Kurogiri answered for Imoku. Tomura wouldn't have hesitated to kill a child. Nor would Sensei, if it had to be done. And he looked at Izuku. He would as well. If it had to be done. Tomura wouldn't regret it. Sensei might have regretted the potential destroyed in Izuku, apparently he'd turned the potential into his gain anyway. Think of Carrie as her legacy, but one you won't have to put up with, Izuku told Dabi and Himiko. It was his very clear dismissal of the situation. It had happened about 10 years back. It was old news. Now, do you Jensen lady need anything? Imoku asked, moving on to a new topic. Oh, Izu. Toga giggled. You know what I want. No, I am not letting you finger paint me in blood, he replied, laughing. She whined. Dabi rolled his eyes at the exchange. Toga was so predictable, but he had no idea where she had gotten the pet name for Imoku. Kurojiri just looked on. The bartender had become very used to this sort of thing. Of all of them, Toga was the one least suited to regular work. She did it because it made money, but she slacked off the most of them. It wasn't that bad though. Imoku kept her busy himself spying on things. Kurojiri suspected Toga knew every blind spot in the House of Parliament. Nothing? Nah, you've left us pretty well set up, Dabi told him. I thought I had, Imoku said, his voice disappointed. That got attention. Is there something, Imoku? Kurojiri asked. Ujiko, the politician, said the name. She's been running side businesses. He held up one hand. I don't mind reasonable profit, Imoku said with a grin. Dabi and Toga returned his grin. Kurojiri nodded. But these are no longer side. They are her main business, and she hasn't been discreet. They are a weakness, and through them, she is a weakness. I'll tell her to rein it in, Dabi promised. Ujiko was a valued member of the league, and as a warp quirk user, was one of their assets, but she had to obey the rules. This wasn't the first time she'd been somewhat independent. Some independence was expected, and Imoku allowed and encouraged that, but the rules were the rules, and they were for the protection of the entire league. Including her. Imoku nodded. I'll put it this way. Explodokill will exploit them, and if she gets taken, the politician shook his head. They all recognized the implications. If she got taken, then she would be questioned in. Well, there was no telling what would happen from there. She also knew who Imoku was, and Kurojiri expected that he would defend that knowledge savagely. I'll talk to her, Dabi promised again more urgently. He knew what the boss was saying. Then I'd better go, Imoku said, looking at his watch. After that, he turned and pulled his jacket from the back of the chair before he looked pensive. Actually, there is one more thing. Kurojiri asked. I doubt you will have a chance, since I'm pretty sure he's given up that sort of thing, but if you do see Lemillion at that, Imoku waggled his eyebrows, take him out. You're sure? Dabi sought confirmation. Imoku had said he'd deal with him. Only if you see him out as a vigilante, Imoku clarified. I'm pretty sure you won't, but if he wants to make it easy, I'm not about to let that opportunity go. Even if we are seen? Even if you are seen. But I've read his assessments, Imoku chuckled. I don't think he will, which is such a pity, especially given his quirk. Toga laughed at that. You just want to take it away. The look Imoku gave her was odd. Kurojiri didn't know what to think, but he knew that there was something else going on there. He reviewed what he knew of Lemillion's quirk. He could phase, Kurojiri remembered, because that was one of the things they had been worried about when Tomura planned the attack. And there was some sort of note that he had a quirk mutation appear late in his high schooling. Was that what interested Imoku? It had to be. But why would a quirk mutation interest Imoku? What did he know? If we see him, the warp villain assured Imoku. Good, he nodded. Though I suspect I'll be dealing with him. Imoku folded his jacket over one arm and downed the last of his beer. By the time he'd finished, Kurojiri had opened a warp gate back to his apartment. Imoku gave them a smile and stepped back before the gate closed. Most of the league didn't even notice the boss leaving, and that's the way he liked it. Dabi sighed. Take out Explodokill, he murmured. Kurojiri could see the way his mind was running through the problems that entailed. Toga, Dabi said, looking over at the young woman. She grinned at him. Izu's given me some time, she told him happily. I'll go find him, she added. They knew who she meant. The fire villain nodded, but Kurojiri saw the way he worried his lip. "Be careful," he said. "I'm always careful," Himiko scoffed. "No," Dabi said, his voice serious. "I mean it. Be careful. Explodokill doesn't play by the rules, and he's not stupid." There was a genuine note of concern lacing his tone. Toga picked it up. In the past she would have dismissed Dabi's warning. This time, she just nodded. "I know, Izu's warned me. Trust me, he hates Explodokill more than the rest of us." Kurojiri watched the way Dabi blinked at that. He couldn't see the connection. How did a member of the House of Representatives even know a vigilante? Kurojiri would be confused himself if he didn't know Imoku's history. If he didn't know who Imoku was, and know that there was something between the two. Why? Dabi finally asked, his desire to know outweighing what was good manners in villain society. Himiko grinned at him before she shook her head. "No idea. But if Izu wants him dead, then Izu gets him to be dead," she chirped. That was more familiar ground for Dabi. Ever since Toga had taken out Tomura, or even before that, there was no question that she was Imoku's girl. Dabi didn't resent it. Imoku was the boss, and if he could put up with her, then, well, good luck to him. Though Dabi was sure that Imoku was not banging her simply because Toga never put on airs. So that was something. Well, Imoku can have him dead, and then we get to show to the world that we aren't as gone as they'd like. Toga nodded. Kurojiri gave Dabi an odd look. "You are sure?" "What do you mean?" "You're sure you want to give up your day job?" the bartender asked. The fire villain looked pensive for a moment. "I'm going to have to think about it," he admitted. Kurojiri nodded, allowing himself to feel amused. It appeared Imoku had domesticated them. Money bought off most, even the League of Villains, but... He looked up at those gathered. They were the older members. Those who had been here the longest. Maybe domestication wasn't a bad thing. There were no heroes, good or otherwise. Society was on the way to seeing people as being people, not as being their quirk. So really, maybe remaining as they were was acceptable. They had, after all, already changed the world. And there weren't many who could claim that. "I still think you should be the one running, sir," the young man said, as he adjusted his tie. He was a large man and not an ounce was fat. Muscle filled out his suit, giving him a look that reminded many of All Might in his prime. "We discussed this," his companion said. "You'll give the better impression, Mirio." But nothing, the former pro-hero Sir Night-Eye snapped back before his protege could list reasons. Except he knew some of those reasons were very real concerns. "You are young, which is a good thing. It gives you a point of difference from everyone and allows you to attract the younger voters." Actually, Mirio was more than young. At 28, he was the youngest candidate in history, but while that made him unusual, it made him very attractive to the younger voters, those who had grown up knowing heroes. And given that Mirio was a former pro-hero and his campaign was being managed by other former pro-heroes, that just reinforced that image. Anyone wanted to overturn the Heroes Must Be Heroes legislation was getting on Mirio's bandwagon. He was careful to say he didn't want to overturn all the legislation, just the later aspects of it. That additions that had turned it from being beneficial to being constrictive. "Yes, but I'm not the only young candidate." Sir Night-Eye grinned. He knew who Mirio was referring to. Representative Imoku Kakariri was 48, but still looked much younger. His green hair was untouched by gray and he gave off a good impression. Yet he was the enemy. There was absolutely no doubt about that. Mirio wasn't running directly against Kakariri. That would be political suicide. Kakariri's constituents loved him to the point where the major parties didn't even bother running an alternate candidate against him. A few minor wannabes tried, and all got crushed. Mirio was running in a different electorate, one that had been determined to be as close to Kakariri's as possible. Not in distance, but in social makeup. Sir Night-Eye didn't like to admit it, but in this, they really were learning from the enemy. 20 years is a big gap, and once he turns 50, he's not going to be able to pull off the young and hip routine, no matter how hard he tries. The response made Mirio smile. Kakaridi never mentioned his age, so they were mentioning it as much as possible. When Mirio got elected, they needed the government to think that he was the voice of the younger generation, not Kakaridi. That would then pull attention from Kakaridi and provide Mirio the opening to amend the bill. They needed to remind that government that Kakaridi was now closer to the normal age they expected. It wasn't going to be that easy. They all knew that, but something had to be done. There is also some good news, Sir Night-Eye continued. Mirio looked at him. On the stage, the speech was coming to an end and he was on next. Sir Night-Eye grinned. Aizawa's found someone for the more physical tasks. Mirio translated the statement. When he'd agreed to be the face running for the House of Representatives, he'd made those supporting him promise they wouldn't hide anything. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't naive, but he was surprised by how ruthless the former pro-heroes had been when discussing various aspects. The need for someone to do the dirty work had come up. Whoever it was, had to be strong. Their quirk had to be strong, and unspoken was that they had to be disposable. He could not afford to be associated with them, otherwise, the public was a fickle mistress. They could turn against him quickly. There were quite a few people who fitted into the strong with a strong quirk category. On those grounds Mirio himself was perfect, but he wasn't disposable. Both because he was running, and because of the quirk he'd inherited. Yagi had been pleased to hear the news that All for One had died, but All Might was also concerned that the ancient villain might have passed on his quirk, just as he had passed on his will to the League of Villains. Do I know them? Probably not, Night-Eye replied. It's someone who legitimately failed the psyche assessments. Aizawa says he needed help, but he did want to be a hero and has turned to vigilantism. At that, Mirio raised one eyebrow. Vigilantes were not tolerated these days. Heroes weren't either, but in practice the police would look the other way if a former pro-hero did something to aid in their case. So long as they weren't caught. He had once held a robber in place until the police arrived. They labeled it a citizen's arrest and forgot to include his name. He'd felt good when he'd done it. It felt right, even if the law said it wasn't. I'll meet him later, Mirio decided. Yep, Sir Night-Eye agreed. Mirio was on now. Remember the spiel. In removing heroes we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. The risk from villains isn't past, and society needs protection. Mirio nodded, putting on a big smile as he turned away from Sir Night-Eye. The crowd cheered as he walked on to the stage. Sir Night-Eye watched his former sidekick with one eye. Most of his attention was on the crowd. They were marketing Mirio as a political All Might. It was a risk. Physically, Mirio could pull off the kind of stunts All Might had. He had the quirk after all, and his own one. But politically? No, they were well aware that the All Might of politics was Imoko Kakaridi, who they suspected as being part, if not the leader, of the League of Villains. Aizawa had the theory but no proof. Events over the years supported the theory, but Kakaridi could simply be very good at reading the mood of the public. It was better to accept the simple explanation over conspiracy. Though if he was the leader, he was doing a very, very good job of controlling them. In the wake of the vote, the police and military had been braced for assaults by the League. A few heroes had been as well, and their activities would have been overlooked if the League attacked. They did nothing. They went to ground. And then Tomura Shigaraki's body appeared. Speculation had been intense then, that the League was infighting. It wouldn't be the first time a villainous group had fallen apart after getting what they wanted. When no other bodies appeared, it became clear it had been a coup. Whoever was in charge knew what they were doing. The League didn't attack. The police and military relaxed and society moved on from the vote. The lack of attacks was the best move the League could make then. No attacks meant no questioning from the public and life went on. Of course, underground heroes did track the League, some of them at least. they were found to be entering employment. None of it legitimate but enough to make money. The underground heroes couldn't do anything about it and the police were instructed not to act. Sir Night-Eye still didn't know where that order had come from. After all, what the League was doing was still illegal even if it wasn't as spectacularly destructive as their usual ploys. But life moved on. Sir Night-Eye sighed. Even if Kakariki was not the leader of the League, one thing was known. Kakariki had drafted the Heroes Must Be Heroes bill, which had then morphed and changed until the vote. After that, he had suggested ways of dismantling the system even quicker. He might only have intended the HMBH bill to be something to guarantee the mental stability of heroes, but he hadn't held back when it became more guilt by association. He was the enemy, in a political sense. The government, those members of the ruling party, they would follow whatever got them votes and popularity. They had to show it was no longer Kakariki. Sir Night-Eye smiled when some of the crowd looked at him. Then he discreetly pointed towards Mirio. They were meant to be paying attention to him. The mother looked slightly guilty, then grinned at him before turning her attention back to Mirio. Still, he hoped the interaction, such as it was, would leave a positive impression on her. That's what they had to do. Sir! The stage whisper caught his attention. Sir Night-Eye turned. His smile slid from his face as he recognized the speaker. Miko Kusha was a snitch. At the moment, she was on their side, and payments were being made to ensure she remained on their side. She was a public servant in the Department of Justice. You have something? He demanded. They'd agreed earlier that pleasantries just wasted time, and they couldn't afford the connection to be known. Miko handed HM a thin sheaf of documents. You need to look at Biosimib Industries, and what they are making for the Department of Justice. It's good, he asked. If you can find the right connections, it's pure gold, she told him. Sir Night-Eye nodded and Miko backed away. It appeared he had some research to do. It was a good thing he was good at it. He was better at research than he was at looking into the future. He huffed. It wasn't something he'd ever let Mirio see. The boy had just gotten over blaming himself and he was somewhat thankful that Mirio didn't ask questions. Others had, and Sir Night-Eye had no answers for them. He'd never seen this future AFO. Masami Sato looked down at her phone when it beeped. She flicked it to silent before looking at the message. How is your campaign going, Masami? A smile spread over her features as she read it. Imoku was always so thoughtful. She glanced at the time. She had time to reply now, though Kakariki would understand if she didn't. So how was her campaign going? Not as good as yours, but no one has your numbers. How do you do it? All polling in his region had Imoku leading by a huge margin. He would win by a landslide. He was the representative for literally the safest seat in the country. It hadn't been the safest when he'd taken it. Imoku had made it that way. Trade secret. Masami rolled her eyes, giving a brief snort of laughter at the reply. We are in the same trade. She couldn't help but point out the obvious. Independent secret? Laughing face. She could see the smirk on his face with his reply. The big grin smiley was not needed. It hardly seemed right to think it, but Imoku was a ratbag at times. Masami sighed before she typed her reply. If I thought I'd have any chance as an independent, I'd do it. Well, she'd think about it at least. There were days when Imoku seemed to do so much more than she did. And give up the position as foreign minister? There was a lot of doubt in the single text. Okay, maybe not. There might be days when Imoku seemed to do more than she did, but he didn't deal with the rest of the world the way she did. That was something Masami knew she'd never experience as an independent. She had to stay with her party for that, and she had been rewarded. No, stuff that. She'd earned her ministry. She'd worked her butt off for it. You aren't in any danger, are you? There was real concern in the text. the jovial atmosphere of earlier disappearing. Masami decided to play it up. Are you offering to help? If he could tell her how he kept such a good relationship with his constituents, that would be a win. That would be something she could tell everyone in her party. Of course, they'd probably use it to try to challenge Kakariri, and then he'd do something outrageous and win back his seat. And how would I help? Our electorates are very separate. Oh, there was a sting there. It was subtle, but she could read it. It sounded like an offer to help, or to assist, and Masami knew he would help if he could, but there would be a price. Still, he could help her out in other ways, ways that didn't require a political favor. You do get the best advertising rates. Ah. The single word conveyed so much meaning. He saw where she was going now. So? Masami prompted. If Kakariri could help, she wasn't going to say no. And he could help with advertising. Kuenshu owns them, but Kuenshu doesn't interfere with their running. Masami could hear his huff. Imoko didn't have to type the words for her to read the prefix. Must I remind you again? Imoko's ownership of Kuenshu was well known. Kuenshu's ownership of other companies was equally well known, as was the fact that Kuenshu was merely the owner of stock. Kuenshu didn't have a commanding voice in the operations of the companies it owned. Though, there was equally no doubt that if Imoko truly wanted, he could persuade the companies to do things. Which is why you have full-page spreads. At least, he had them in his electorate, and he had a great deal of area-specific net advertising. It was one of the reasons polling was so favorable for Kakariri. Paid for legitimately out of my advertising budget. That much was true, and was known. Campaign budgets had to be declared. As an independent, Imoka didn't have to get approval for his, but as an independent they were scrutinized to ensure that he was spending any political donations wisely. And that said donations were properly declared and legal. Masami couldn't help but give that reply. He had to rub it in. She had a budget as well. But Imoka texted a reply before she could become indignant. Could help you with budgeting if you want. It was a generous offer, but she couldn't take it up, and Kakariri knew it. Party member, remember. Can't change the ratios they deem best. There were good and bad points to that. The party had established ratios on the amount and what to spend it on. They were approved, and most of the parties used a similar ratio. It meant they weren't accusing each other of impropriety as much, when each spent the money the same way. Well, their ratios are wrong. He pointed it out as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Masami smiled again at her phone, already typing her reply. Given your results, I can't argue. No one could argue with Kakariri's election results. He didn't reply straight away and Masami checked the time. She was up soon, but it felt wrong to just put her phone away now. Just check the numbers, you will be fine, Ms. Minister. Ah, so that's what he was doing, checking the opinion polls for her electorate. On those at least, as he had pointed out, she was winning by a comfortable margin. Hope so, Mr. Independent, though I probably will be Ms. Shadow Minister soon enough. She was winning by a comfortable margin in her electorate. Others in her party weren't going anywhere near as well. Yeah, probably. You've had a good run though. Imoku never sugar-coated the truth. At that, she sighed, before replying. It will be odd to be in opposition. You forget, I've never been there. Kakariri was right. They had had a very good run. And that was partially why others weren't doing as well. To the public, Masami thought they just felt stale. They had gotten through quite a few major changes for the country, such as the reintegration of heroes, and the public had supported that for the last 10 years, but now they wanted a change. Still, Masami was proud of what they had achieved. The country was in a good position, and that's really all any government could boast about. As an independent, I'm always in opposition. He always had a counter. BS. You are one of the best connected in politics. Did Imoku really think that independents had lunch with the Prime Minister as much as he did? Did he believe that they were as involved in policy as he was? No. She knew he didn't. Masami knew that Kakuriti was aware of how well connected he was, but sometimes he needed to be reminded of that fact. And sometimes he needed to be brought back to earth. Well, even when you are Ms. Shadow Minister, I'll still talk to you. Oh. He deliberately riled her up. She could feel his laugh in their reply. Time was nearly up though. She smiled at the phone and typed her response. I know you will. Anyway, I have a speech, and you probably have something to do. Imoku always had something to do. He was probably the busiest representative of them all, because he still managed to run his companies, on top of a full government schedule. True. Good luck with the speech. It was a kind send-off. Masami knew Imoku meant it. He wasn't just typing it. Thanks. She checked again that her phone was on silent before slipping it into her pocket. Masami nodded to herself as she smoothed her skirt. Even as busy as he was, Imoku made time to talk to her. He made time for her, and her party. He was her friend in a place where she'd been told she would have no friends. Imoku was special, and Masami appreciated that. It's one of the reasons she helped him where she could, because he helped her. He was a good man. She was proud to call him friend. And she knew, no matter how the election went, he'd still call her friend. In politics, that was rare, but that was Imoku. He was, somehow, impossibly, everyone's friend AFO. Toga was thankful that her Izu insisted she remain fit even though the league wasn't as publicly active as they had been. If she wasn't, she would never have kept up. When she'd volunteered to follow Explodokill, she hadn't realized how fit the vigilante was. He could move. And he had to stop every now and then to check if there was something he could poke his nose into. She was just following. This was exhausting. The other thing she was thankful for was that Izu had insisted on finding the limit of her quirk. Himiko had thought she had a good idea of what she could do. She knew nothing. The politician was endlessly curious. He wanted to know everything. And he had many opportunities to ask, and to experiment in the evenings after they ate, when he was visiting his mother. He would never answer how he got some of the blood, but in the first few weeks, there was always several vials of blood waiting for her. Toga had learned a lot then. She had learned she could change from person to person, without going through her natural form. She learned how long she could remain in one form, and she learned exactly how much blood she needed to transform. Izuku gave her efficiency, and never once berated her for wanting to cut things. His only specification if she wanted to cover him in blood was that it wasn't his blood. No one else would ever get away with such a request. Hanzi hadn't. Fire didn't. Misty cheated and never let blood onto him. Izuku didn't mind. And he made her efficient. He also made sure she was always properly equipped. He was different from Hanzi. He always made sure they all had the right equipment. When he'd asked her who she would follow, it wasn't even a competition. Toga licked at a pre-prepared slide and felt her features shift. Just in time. Explodokill looked back. His eyes traced over her, and Himiko could feel the red orbs judging her. Oh. She wanted to make him covered in blood. It would teach him to look down on her. Toga could tell he looked down on everyone. Even those he saved. He saw no one as an equal. She licked another slide, shifting again. It was tedious, and her clothing didn't change with her quirk, but Izu had made her deal with that as well. She always wore pants these days. Reversible. Along with shirts and jackets that were all reversible. There was always a scarf or something in her kit too. It gave her versatility, and she had gotten away with. Well, more than the police knew. It was a high. It was a thrill. It was joy. And she loved the fact that Izu had given it to her. No questions, no judgments. His questions were so she got better. His judgments were to assess her skill. He was so much better than Hanzi. Himiko looked back to Explodokill. She blinked. He wasn't there. A glance told her the blonde wasn't anywhere she could see. Gotcha. Instinct made her duck. Toga felt the ping of debris hit her back, even as she rolled forward. She pulled one of her knives and slashed haphazardly. It hit nothing. Dumb bitch, Explodokill growled. Didn't even notice I was bringing you here. At that, Himiko looked around. Shit, she knew what he meant now. There was no one around. Except. Toga giggled. This is my area, she told him as she turned to face the vigilante. They were in a bad part of the city. It was the area the League made their own. Except Toga knew that the League wasn't here at the moment. It was just her and him because no bystanding idiot would get involved. He snorted at her. I'm not stupid. Toga looked at him. He was reasonably handsome and very well muscled. The vigilante had wild, spiky hair and sharp red eyes. There were several scars visible, going under his costume. That was to be expected given his line of work. He wore heavy boots and had something around his neck. He didn't have any gloves but did have gauntlets. She remembered him from the time Hanzi kidnapped him. The gauntlets were much smaller now. Himiko pulled one of her other knives. She resisted the urge to lick at the slide that was inbuilt into the guard. Izu had made her find out how well she could fight in the shapes she could assume. She already knew she didn't get any of their quirk ability, just their appearance, but Toga now knew she did get a proportion of their strength. Each of her knives had a different slide of blood built in. Each slide was someone different, giving her some advantage. There was even one that had, ugh. She was not going to use that one. A girl had some limits. Except. Izu had forced her to know one more thing. Her limits. Looking into the mad red eyes, Toga wasn't sure she could win. Everyone thought she was insane, and maybe she was, but she knew her limits. She knew what she was capable of. The man in front of her, he was mad. There was a light in his eyes that said he'd go through anything. Himiko didn't let the smile fade from her features. Just looking, explodey, she told him. Yeah, well you can look at this, he snarled, driving one hand forward. Toga could actually see the explosions on his palm. She ducked under the punch, but didn't see the kick that caught her side. Himiko tumbled. It was no worse than sparring with Dabi or one of the others, though the vigilante was strong. You could go easy, she muttered. I was only looking, Toga repeated. He grinned at her. It was not a nice grin. His canines caught on his lip. Oh, I don't think so. You're gonna tell me everything about your slimeball fucker of a boss. You could always just ask Dabi, you know. Himiko replied lightly. You are a vigilante. We have some things in common. Not that this vigilante would ever join with the League, but she needed some time. She kept her eyes on him but split her attention, examining everything she could see. There was a laneway behind him, and several rusty fire escapes. She could. No, she couldn't. This moron could use his quirk to extend his jumping. Putting herself up high just made it more convenient for her to have an accident. That left the ground. Toga didn't like it, but she was a villain, and she was a true villain. She had no pride, except for the next hit. And Izu needed her. Not that shit, Explodokill growled. Your real fucking boss, Izuku. With her quirk, Himiko Toga was a born actress. She had no tells. Who? Even if she did, she wouldn't betray Izu. She knew she'd given nothing away, but Explodokill's expression didn't change. He didn't even blink at her confusion. Which meant he must know some other way, but she wasn't going to confirm it for him. That fucking Deku. He charged. Toga was ready for him this time. She dodged, avoiding his foot, and this time she gave him a slight push before she ran. Knowing when to fight was what made someone a good villain. It was time for her to run. Bitch! Explodokill screamed, and Himiko felt the rush of hot air on her back. He was fast and he wasn't afraid of injuring her. Well, she wasn't afraid of injuring him. She kept running, reaching into a pocket to pull out a fistful of ball bearings. She dropped them as she ran. It was nice to hear him slip. It wouldn't be enough to lose him. It gave her distance. Toga plowed into one of the doors. It gave and she found herself in darkness. She dropped the last of her ball bearings as she moved into the room. She looked around. Stairwell. There. Himiko ran towards it. She pulled out her heavy knife. It was the one with the special blood. Toga jumped down the stairs, going into the basement. There was a roar of anger from behind her. Explodokill had found the new set of ball bearings. She looked around desperately and was pleased to see a Gatic point. Toga went over to it and knelt down, putting her hand on it, before she brought the knife to her lips. Explosions came from above her as Toga sucked on the blood. Her shape shifted, growing larger. She felt muscles form and her hair disappeared. Her clothes didn't ripen for this form, she just went with a small loincloth. It didn't need anything else. Explodokill leapt down the stairs. Toga snarled. The sound reverberated from deep within her and she was pleased when the vigilante froze for an instant. She rose, the hand that was on the Gatic ripped it up, cracking the concrete. Himiko flung the cover at Explodokill. He exploded it. And then gasped. What? That's just rude, Toga growled, grabbing at the concrete. She hurled it at him. Again he exploded it. Careful, she warned. The smell of sewage filled the room. From what she could see from the corner of her eye, it was mainline. Himiko knew from Izu that you weren't meant to build over main lines, but this was a bad part of town. Little things like planning rules were overlooked. That got his attention. Bitch! Explodokill raged. What the fuck are you? He added. Himiko knew what she looked like. It felt odd. This form was literally muscles upon muscles, but it always made her feel itchy. Things weren't where they were meant to be. It was partially because the form was male but mostly because it was Numu. She had to remember not to scratch at her head and the exposed brain. But the advantage of this form was that it was strong and intimidating. She didn't have any of the Numu's real power, and it was going to be a pain trying to get a refill for her knife, but for this moment it was worth it. And she would be able to do a bit more than just run. She had her pride, and Izu wanted this one dead. She picked up more concrete and flung it towards the vigilante. He dodged. At least he recognized the danger, and Himiko was forced to admit he was far more flexible than she thought. And dangerous. Explodokill advanced, murder in his eyes. What stopped this moron? She grabbed a larger piece of concrete. It was nice being able to pick it up easily. Toga swung it like a club, but Explodokill was faster. He dodged and then threw a punch. She was expecting it and blocked with the Numu's strength. The shock reverberated through her system. He didn't have a strength quirk, but he trained. You fucking bitch are coming with me, he growled. You're not cute at all. Toga swung one huge arm, hoping to catch the vigilante, but he was ready and countered with a kick. She was stronger, but it was false strength and she knew if she stayed much longer. She drove the Numu's claws towards his face. Maybe she'd get lucky. Again he countered, but Himiko was ready for that and she jumped back to the sewer hole. This was going to be gross, but better than the vigilante. The huge form splashed into the muck. It was warm. It was foul. She hated this. He was going to pay. At least he didn't follow. Himiko moved quickly, splashing through the muck. She kept her ears open for the sounds of pursuit. It came, but she was ready for that. She turned into a connecting line. It was slightly smaller. The bulk of her form almost touched the walls, but she could move freely still. She moved down the pipe and listened. He was still following. At least there were no explosions. Explodokill had that much self-restraint. Toga pulled a large knife. She readied it. Explodokill lunged around the corner. She threw her knife. The vigilante raised his hands, and Himiko laughed when the knife thunked into one. She didn't wait for any response. "Bitch!" The scream came from behind her. Hopefully he'd pull back. She picked another rejoining pipe and squeezed into it. The smell was terrible, but she couldn't focus on that. Instead, Toga pulled one of her prepared slides and licked the blood. It gave her a smaller form. She moved faster. Another line, it was getting too small now, and she spotted a manhole. "Bitch!" The scream reverberated through the tunnels. Himiko jumped for the shaft, her hands gripping the rungs of the ladder, and she hauled herself upwards. At least her hands were dry, but her feet slipped when they landed on the steps. She adapted, pushing them up against the side so that they couldn't slip further. She moved as fast as she could and threw her shoulder against the cover when she reached it. It was smaller than the cover she'd used the Numus form to lift. It moved slightly and Toga peered out. A roadway. It couldn't have been that far from where they had been. She pushed it further and hauled herself out, looking around. She was covered in filth. That was the secondary issue. Toga cocked her head. She couldn't hear the vigilante but had to get under cover. She licked at another slide, this time letting the liquid paste that covered her melt away entirely. Thankfully most of the muck went with it, and she delicately stepped over the splashes as she made her way to the footpath. Once there, she ran, passing several laneways before she turned down one. Toga leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. She waited for a few moments before peeking around the corner. She watched the manhole cover. The road was relatively quiet, but a car had already noticed the hole. The driver had stopped before crashing and was currently trying to push the cover back. Himiko smiled. She'd done it. She placed one hand on her chest as her heartbeat returned to normal. Sure, she hadn't killed him, but she'd gotten away. That was something. And she had information for Izuku. Somehow the vigilante knew who he really was. How did that happen? Toga didn't know, but Izuku would. Izuku knew everything. And Izuku deserved everything. She had to tell him. Whistling, Himiko continued down the lane. She had a good story to tell. A fop. Mirio's phone pinged. He looked down at it. The message was from Sir. Have it. He frowned and typed back. What is it? The dots to indicate that Sir Night-Eye was replying appeared immediately. An informant told me to look at Biosimap Industries and the Department of Justice. That meant he had information. What information? His mind was going over what he knew of Biosimap Industries, and Mirio had to admit it wasn't much. It wasn't anything, actually. He'd never heard of the company, and he wondered what they had to do with the Department of Justice. With a name like Bio, it was pretty obvious they weren't a law firm. I'll tell you tonight. Mirio frowned at that. When they were heroes, keeping information back was a bad thing. You're sure? Positive. He doesn't even know I'm looking. The House of Representatives candidate frowned at his phone. That type of answer was one given when things usually went wrong. There was only one reply he could give. Mirio could almost see Sir Night-Eye's huff. It wouldn't be obvious. In fact, most would miss it, but he knew his former boss was thinking it. That will change when you announce this. I am being careful. There was no italic on the message, but there should have been. Mirio could hear the stress on the M. That wasn't the point. I don't want you hurt. That was the core of the matter. He didn't want Sir Night-Eye hurt any further, especially not on what was meant to be a research run. They were dealing with dangerous foes, enemies who wouldn't hesitate and who thought nothing of killing. The just hit it better than traditional villains. It wasn't your fault. I've told you that before. I'll tell you that again. As many times as it takes. Ouch. He could feel Sir Nightie's frustration through the phone, but it didn't matter what the former pro-hero thought. It was my fault. Somehow the dots on the screen showed the way his former mentor sighed. There was nothing that could be done differently. And it's nice. The message came quickly. Nice? You lost your quirk. It's not nice. Without actually going to a voice call, that was about as well as Mirio could express himself, and there had to be some reason Sir Night-Eye had texted him rather than called him. It is nice, sometimes. Not to see the future. Not to know that there is nothing you can't change. He hadn't expected that answer. And Mirio reluctantly admitted to himself that maybe Sir Night-Eye had a point. He had never thought about what it meant to see the future. Except, Sir Night-Eye had never mentioned that the future could change. On the few times they had discussed it, he had been adamant that nothing could change his visions. Is this the future you saw? Another answer he wasn't expecting, but it would be too easy to let Sir Night-Eye just leave it at that. This was more important. Is this the future you saw? Mirio repeated his earlier text. No. Mirio waited for further explanation. He stared at his phone. The dots remained there, but nothing came. A minute passed. 2. Then 3. Then the dots disappeared. He waited some more. It wasn't the easiest topic, but he was owed answers. After 10 minutes, he typed a reply. Sir Night-Eye owed him that much of an answer. Especially given that he hadn't said anything before. This was meant to be what he saw. If it wasn't, why hadn't he said anything? What? I thought you saw this for me? There was a long break before the next answer, but Mirio could see the dots that indicated Sir Night-Eye was at least looking at the screen. He wondered what was so hard to answer. I never saw All Might living past Kamino. I never saw this particular future. I never knew that my visions could be changed. But they can. Which is why no longer having them is a blessing. I have no expectation. I have no preconception of what should happen. That means I can focus on what I want to happen. Mirio read the text several times. He shivered. He never knew that Sir had seen that future for All Might. Yagi was still injured and frail, but he was still definitely alive. Medical science had worked wonders on the former #1 hero. But had Sir Night-Eye just admitted the future could be changed? He had practically admitted it previously, but this felt different. Seeing it in text, not just implied, made it all the more real, but Mirio needed confirmation. So, something has changed? Something has changed. Sir Night-Eye knew how to state the obvious, and how to text without saying anything. Mirio had to remind himself to be gentle with his phone before he broke it. The case was reinforced, but he could still crush it into a marble if he wanted. What changed? He typed, stabbing his finger at the keypad just lightly enough that it didn't break the screen. It took a lot of restraint on his part. The dots reappeared, and then, the message did. What? Mirio exclaimed. But before he could text another response, another message from Sir Night-Eye appeared. Don't know. It was Mirio's turn to reply with the dots. Then he sighed heavily, and typed a more reasonable response. Something more important. Do the others know? The reply was quick. They've never asked. Knowing the future is not that much of a gift. That really wasn't satisfying. Something drastic must have happened if they weren't in the future Sir Night-Eye had seen, but Mirio really didn't know what that event might have been. There was only one person he could think of who might have changed things, and he was someone who'd been dead for years. All Might's nemesis, All for One. The ancient villain might have done something except. What? He'd been incarcerated for years. Or was it the man they were now trying to bring down? Imoku Kakariti. He was a businessman, not the usual foe for a hero, but he had influenced the world so much. It could have been him too, because Sir Night-Eye wouldn't have considered him when looking into the future. Do you think it's him? Have you ever thought about what has changed? Is it Kakariki? Mirio could almost hear his mentor sigh. I don't think it's him alone. It's probably something All for One has done. Maybe something All Might did. We will never know. It's best not to think about it. On that, I know. Again, there were no italics in the text, but Mirio could read them loud and clear. Sir would know what it meant to worry about the future, and the response displayed that he had thought about it. Both suspects were mentioned, but neither could be confirmed. Or it could be someone else, someone they never even thought of. The future was a bit like time, there were so many theories, but no one knew which was true. Don't like it. He really didn't like it. Focus on the future. Don't think of the past, because it is the past, and we have to look to the future. Mirio could see Sir Night-Eye smile through the phone and gave the only reply he could. I'll try.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.